Welcome to this episode of Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Cader, the show where I take an interesting perspective through interviewing key figures in the arena of foreign affairs and diplomacy. I'm Adil Cader, your host. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the role of think tanks in foreign policy, and who better to have than the president of one of the world's leading foreign policy think tanks, Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Richard Haass is currently president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, non-partisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the US and other countries. In 2013, he served as the chair of the multiparty negotiations in Northern Ireland that proved the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. Among his extensive experience in government, he previously served as Director of Policy Planning for the State Department, as an advisor to Secretary Powell, as well as being a Senior Director for the National Security Council. He has won numerous awards and honorary degrees, including the Presidential Citizens Medal. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor degree from Oberlin College and a master and doctorate of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He is the author of 14 books on American foreign policy and one on management. His latest book is The World, A Brief Introduction, published by Penguin Press. Dr. Haass, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Otto. Look forward to the conversation.
Let's start with the basic overall question. What role do you see think tanks playing in the contribution to foreign policy?
It's a basic question, and it's important. It's an important question. I believe what think tanks can do is essentially be generators of ideas, analysis, in ways that are policy relevant. And I emphasize that because increasingly universities have opted out of policy relevant enterprise. A lot of it is quantitative, a lot of it is theoretical, a lot of it is removed. I think it's a mistake. I think it's unfortunate. But what that has done is opened up an enormous space for people who have academic skills, the analytical skills, the critical thinking skills, the ability to communicate, but to focus, again, not on abstraction, not on models, but on the real world, and to do analysis, to offer up prescriptions about what ought to be done. And ideally, the advantage of people in the think tank world is not only are they different from people in academia, but they're also different from people, say, who are doing journalism. Their work tends to be more descriptive, more day-to-day, hour-to-hour. So again, there's this in-between space where I believe think tanks can and do operate.
And given how much COVID has impacted diplomacy, we've seen various foreign ministries around the world with resources being depleted. How more valuable do you think tanks are to foreign ministries in providing that research and analysis?
Oh, I don't think it has anything to do with COVID. I think it's simply again a time in history where academics have opted out. People in government are often too busy. Quite honestly, I've been in government. I've worked for 4 presidents, and the day-to-day pressures of government, you rarely have time to take a step back and be creative. Henry Kissinger once said that when you go into government, you essentially draw down or deplete your intellectual capital. I think this is an important moment, not because of COVID, but I actually think it's an important moment for think tanks, people who think seriously yet practically about this field, ever since the end of the Cold War. If you think about it, we had a 40-year run, the Cold War. A lot of the intellectual work that framed our thinking about that was done right after World War II. The early works about strategic and nuclear deterrence that was produced in the 40s and 50s. A lot of the basic thinking about, say, how to deal with the Soviet challenge produced in the 40s. There was, when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, I argued that it was an important time for people in government, but again, hard in government, but outside of government, to think big, to be just as creative, to think about what are the policies we need for the new era? What are the institutions we need for the new era? Quite honestly, I'm quite critical. I don't think for the most part, governments or think tanks or anybody else have met this challenge. But much more than COVID, I believe it was the end of the Cold War that created a moment for people in this space to step up.
And talking about government think tanks really plays into the notion of the multi-track diplomatic system, going against this common misconception that diplomacy is just a government to government level. You've had an extensive career in diplomacy, working in various government departments. How has your view on the dynamic of the multi-track diplomacy changed throughout your career?
Look, governments have unique authority, but they're not the only actors. You have actors, whether it's think tanks or NGOs, the corporate world. I believe their interactions are important. Sometimes they need to be brought into formal diplomacy. If you were going to have a meeting today about what to do about COVID, you would want the biotech companies and the pharmaceutical companies to be brought in. If you were going to have a meeting about how to regulate cyberspace, you would obviously have to bring Twitter and Facebook and Google and other such companies into the room for the conversation. What I think you're also though getting at is whether there's a place for diplomacy or diplomatic interaction with people who are not formally in government. Sometimes it's called track 2, track 1.5. And my own view is it can be a somewhat valuable supplement to formal diplomacy. It can often be an incubator where ideas are developed and then introduced and, if you will, test driven or test marketed. And if those ideas look promising, if the interaction suggests that there might be some readiness to accept them on the various sides, say to a dispute, then those ideas can ultimately be introduced into formal channels where there is real authority.
And personally, for you, having that extensive diplomatic career and going into your role with the CFR, the think tank, what was that transition like from being in track 1 diplomacy to being involved more in think tank analysis? Was it like be a sports person, a sports star who's an athlete and then goes on to be a commentator watching on the sidelines? What was that transition like?
It's very funny. A little bit. On the other hand, when you run the policy planning staff in government, it's a little bit like being an outsider who's on the inside. You don't have great power or authority. You're a staffer. And it's a difference in government, I think, between those who are, it's called line or staff. And line, you actually have authority. It may be limited, it may be very specific, but you have some operational authority. Staff, you have very little operational authority, but you have the opportunity to influence. Well, that's what outsiders are. You have the opportunity to influence. Government being an important target of your influence or constituency, but not just that. I mean, the way that what the Council on Foreign Relations does, what I do, is yes, we think about influencing the executive branch of the United States, the Congress, other governments, international agencies, but also I spend a lot of time, and the Council spends a lot of time in classrooms in the United States. I want us to be a resource for America, the next generation of Americans, to get them more knowledgeable about the world, to understand why the world matters and how American foreign policy can shape the world. We try to influence the people who give sermons every week in churches and synagogues and mosques. We want to be an influence for them, for the corporate world, because again, they're very influential. So I think of trying to be a resource to have influence. Government, again, is one constituency I want to be a resource for, but it's not limited to that.
Moving on more to the Council of Foreign Relations specifically. Now, according to the annual University of Pennsylvania think tank rankings, this Council of Foreign Relations is one of the highest ranked think tanks in the world as a think tank, but also specifically in the field of foreign affairs. If we look at similar think tanks in the US, such as Brookings, Carnegie, CSIS, or the Wilson Center, the CFI is unique in the sense that you're headquartered in New York. Now, I'm aware you have an office in Washington, D.C., but your main headquarters is in New York as opposed to Washington, D.C. What unique advantages does being headquartered in New York have for your think tank?
Sure. Well, the CFR is different in quite a few ways because I've worked at several of those other places. In the course of my career, I've worked at Carnegie, I've worked at Brookings. The Council, first and foremost, is a membership organization. We've got 5,000 members across the United States. Secondly, we're a publisher. We publish Foreign Affairs magazine, as well as several websites. Third, we convene more than any other institution in the way of meetings in New York and Washington. We're also an educational institution where we've just produced an entire curriculum, World 101, to teach young people and not so young people about foreign policy and the world. We've produced simulations. Our educational materials are being used in over 100 countries. They're being used in high schools and colleges in all 50 states. So we're actually a much broader institution than, we're not quote unquote just a think tank, but we do have a think tank. We have a studies program, the David Rockefeller Studies Program, and that's where we're most like these other institutions. We've got 75, 80 full and part-time scholars generating books and articles that are hopefully, again, policy relevant. I think being in New York is a big financial center. You got a lot of NGOs in New York, a lot of media. So it's not just a government town. Washington is a little bit more one-dimensional. We have an office in Washington. That's an important constituency, executive branch, Congress, and the like. But I believe being in New York gives us a chance to reach other constituencies besides the government.
You're speaking broadly about education, and one thing I find really fascinating about the CFI is you have an explainer section on your website which gives some kind of introduction to various key foreign policy issues, especially now, given that we are in the age of misinformation. How can think tanks play a large educational role? When I say that, I mean specifically beyond that traditional membership subscriber base to, I guess, the more, to put it casually, the more less elite crowd who wouldn't traditionally go to think tank events. How would they be more?
It's an important question. It's the question I asked myself soon after I got to the council 18 years ago, which was, and the council was operating, again, you might call it an elite level. It's not a very popular word, but there you have it. But essentially, we were operating in a world of people who had already decided that the world matters, that foreign policy matters. They had become quite expert about it. And that's an important world. These people have a lot of influence, whether they're in Congress, the executive branch, the people who write the op-eds for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the FT or what have you. And I said, well, obviously, we've got to continue to be an influence, a resource in that world. But that's not enough. That leaves out literally hundreds of millions of Americans. It leaves out billions of people about the world. And I won't speak for other countries, but in our country, we do a terrible job of teaching these issues in our schools. Or in some cases, like the university level, they're offered, but they're not required as a condition of graduation. So the reality is, in our country, just at a time the world's becoming more important than ever, fewer and fewer Americans understand it. We're essentially, the phrase we use is we've got a significant degree of international illiteracy. And I don't mean illiteracy in the sense of not being able to read, but not understanding how the world works, why it matters, and so forth. So we just basically said we're going to operate at both levels, and we're going to continue to try to be a resource for those who are inside the foreign policy debate. But we've also got to be a resource for quote unquote average citizens, typical students, the student who's going to become a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. So they're not going to do this as a career, but they're still going to be a citizen. They're still going to vote. So we increasingly are devoting a significant chunk of our efforts to reaching these people. We do a lot of it on our website, and we do it by producing these explainers and backgrounders, this curriculum I mentioned, World 101. What's interesting, the most popular parts of CFR.org, our website, are these backgrounders and explainers. They are the most heavily trafficked part of the website. So that suggests to me there's a real hunger out there in this world of so much misinformation, where anything and everything can be found online, but there's no gatekeepers. There's no one there saying, read this, ignore that. We found there's a real hunger, and we're trying to meet that desire for serious, authoritative work, fact-driven on the world.
And talking about this hunger to kind of go to these explainer sections, people are aware in this age of misinformation, the need to find correct information on foreign policy. Do you see more and more people increasingly wanting to go into State Department, wanting to go into careers in foreign service because as a result? No,
sir. What we're seeing in this country is just the opposite. I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a real problem. I'm a lot older. When I came of age, I graduated college in the early 70s. Was in high school in the late 60s. international issues were so central, the Vietnam debate, the debates over détente, the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And for a lot of us, going into fields like this there was nothing more exciting. It didn't occur to me not to do it, to be perfectly honest. This was the great question of the day. I think what's happened now, 40, 50 years later, is the best and the brightest are not doing this. They're going into financial engineering at this or that bank or private equity company. We can't compete with the resources. If they're interested in matters of policy, a lot of them are going much more into domestic policy. If you think about the last administration, this administration, much more of an emphasis on things domestic. I also believe that issues like the Iraq War, Afghanistan have soured a lot of younger people on international involvement. They see it as all costs, no benefit. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions. People or younger people, say on campuses, are obviously for good reason extremely interested and concerned about climate change and other issues. But by and large, I'm concerned about this a lot for the most talented young people, with certain exceptions, but by and large are not going into this field. One of the things we're doing as a result, the Council on Foreign Relations, we have made it a major institutional commitment to try to increase the pipeline of talent going into this field. And we've got, for example, a paid internship program. So we have over 120 paid interns a year coming to the council. Well, over the course of a decade, that's over 1,000 young people who have been introduced into foreign policy. We've got a membership program for people in their 30s. Again, we want to get younger Americans involved in the field. It's one of the reasons we're doing all the educational work. We want to reach younger people in middle school, high school, college, to have them see how interesting and how relevant this field is. We're doing a lot of recruiting at schools and colleges that have not always been associated with this field. But because I am worried that we don't simply have the pool of talent and the pipeline of talent we need. And so it's not just that the State Department is not recruiting nearly as well as it used to, but it's the field in general. And I think also we're paying a price for all these attacks on professionals, all these attacks we've seen on the quote unquote deep state, this lack of respect for expertise. So I believe a lot of people are shying away from going into this field, and it will be an expensive development.
You highlighted briefly how there's more interest in the domestic aspect of politics as opposed to foreign policy. This kind of goes into my next question. Is we're seeing quite a bit of partisan divide in the US. What's the difference of the partisan divide we see in domestic politics versus that at a foreign policy level?
We're actually seeing more on the domestic side than on the foreign policy side. I mean, foreign policy doesn't neatly in this country divide along partisan lines. There's a lot of divides in foreign policy over how much it matters. And then you have people on right and left who think it matters a lot or hardly at all. You've got a big divide about what our goals or priorities in the world ought to be, from those who think it ought to be democracy and human rights to those who ought to be something more traditional, quote unquote, in the realm of realism. You've got divides about what tools to use and the role of the executive branch versus Congress, but none of these really divide along partisan lines, which is actually in some ways healthy. For example, it at least holds out the possibility that we could have a degree of consensus and a degree of continuity, say on China policy or on Russia policy. We're not there on climate policy. We're not there. Actually, in trade policy, we have bipartisanship. Unfortunately, I would argue it's in the wrong direction. But right now, we have probable majorities in both parties against free trade, which I believe is economically and strategically short-sighted. But none of these line up consistently one party or the other for the most part. In domestic policy, it's much different. There you've got more fundamental divides about the role of government in the economy, what the social safety net be, what should be government policy on everything from taxes to spending to and so forth. Though again, it's more muddied than it used to be, simply because the Republican Party now is not a conservative party. I grew up in the Republican Party when it was a conservative party, and it had certain views about a limited government role in the economy, certain American role in the world, certain understandings about the limited role of government in the society. This Republican Party is a populist party. It's all over. Suddenly it's in favor of big government. Well, that used to be the province of Democrats. So it's harder to make sense of the American political debate. I would just simply say what's happening though, and I think COVID, coming back to one of your early questions, has accelerated this, is we're seeing two big changes in the United States. One is we're seeing support for a larger government role in the economy. This legislation being considered that would target certain high-tech areas and industries for government spending. That's not the sort of thing you would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. Even more, we're seeing a much bigger government role in the society, a much more extensive social safety net, not simply in the area of healthcare, but transfer payments and the like. And there again, COVID has reinforced it. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation going forward post-COVID, how much of this larger government role in the society continues. Because if we do, either we're going to rack up enormous debt, or we're going to have to increase taxes significantly, or both. And too soon for me to answer that question, but these to me are big historical swings.
The CFI is on the note of partisanship. The CFI is a nonpartisan think tank, and given the partisan divide currently in the US, how vital is nonpartisanship been to your think tank?
I think it's critical. I'm very uncomfortable with think tanks which have ideological slants, because then if you tell me the name of some of these think tanks, I can tell you what they're going to say. But it's always dangerous to have ideology drive analysis and prescription. I want to have analysis drive, speak for itself, and then drive the recommendations. I don't want it pre-cooked. So I think it's essential. And also you want to reach Americans across the divide. Think tanks that are primarily this or that, Democrat or Republican, or are beholden to a certain ideology, that feeds into the divisions we've got in this country. It reinforces them. And again, I'm old fashioned. I grew up in an age where foreign policy, at least in principle, if not in practice, was meant to, partisanship was meant to stop at the water's edge. Essentially, we would have our intense debates in this country, but we would try to face the world more or less united. And I think this was more or less true from the beginning in World War II through much of the Cold War. Obvious divisions over Vietnam and other issues, but the basics of American foreign policy were pretty broadly supported. And this really came, I think the Trump administration was a massive departure. And what I don't know going forward is now whether the Trump administration was just a 4-year exception, and the Biden administration heralds a return to something that's more familiar, or just the opposite, where the Biden administration is a 4-year departure, and we're going to, essentially what Mr. Trump was heralding is in some ways going to become the new normal here. And a lot will depend upon two things. What are the Republican successors to Mr. Trump? What kind of a foreign policy do they endorse? And secondly, in the Democratic Party, what comes after Bidenism? Because even though his domestic policies have been surprisingly liberal, his foreign policies are quite, for the most part, relatively traditional. And the question is, what if the Democratic Party becomes quote unquote more progressive? What does their foreign policy look like? So I just don't have the answer to those questions. So it's a little bit, and this has real implications, by the way, because whether it's where you're sitting or these meetings going on of late in Europe, I think a lot of our allies look at us and suddenly they're less confident about the future path of American foreign policy. We become less predictable, and we become a little bit less reliable because one can't assume that tomorrow's foreign policy will look like today's.
Approaching time, so it's heading into the last question now. One thing I'm really fascinated about the CFI, you started this initiative, the Council of Councils, a bit like a G20 of think tanks. Can you just share more about this initiative and the motivation behind it?
Sure. It's you described it very well. Thank you. We've got about 24 organizations from around the world. We meet several times a year. Essentially, it's to look at issues of global governance Just to be clear, not global government. I'm not saying that, but global governance, ANCE, essentially looking at the rules in the world, the institutions in the world that are meant to deal with global challenges. And you asked before about multi-track diplomacy. This is an attempt at institutionalizing multi-track diplomacy. What I wanted to do was bring together a lot of the leading thinkers from around the world on issues of foreign policy and international relations, have them meet several times, discuss the big issues of the day. What should we be doing about climate change? Or what do we do about proliferation? Or what is the future of the world trading system? What should it look like? How do or could we or should we regulate cyberspace? It's a long, long line of issues. How to improve global health machinery. And then, we don't spend our time negotiating communiques. I'll leave that to the G7. Thank you very much. But the idea is to have these conversations, have papers written, discuss them, have everybody leave the conversation smarter, and then have these people, all of whom are connected to their own governments one way or another, all of whom have influence in their own societies, have them go home and be smarter for it. And so that's the goal. We've been in business for about a decade now. It's a little bit hard to measure the impact, but the quality of the conversations is high. People are thoughtful, they're serious. And I'd like to think it's certainly influencing the think tank world. And then through that, ideally, it is influencing the world beyond these think tanks, whether it's governments or international organizations or simply public debates. But that was the idea of this when we created it about a decade ago. We probably had, 30, 40, 50 meetings over the decade. And the membership, as you say, represents the G20, the principal countries. There will be got representation from all the continents. And I for one have learned a lot. I mean, it's impossible to sit in these meetings and not to come away just simply with a better understanding of the issues, how others see them, how others see you. That's a pretty valuable. That's pretty valuable for anyone in this business.
Just to finish off, I know you said you don't negotiate communiques, but is there like a similarity between your think tank to think tank diplomacy in this Council of Councils? You've noticed compared to diplomacy where you're representing the U.S. delegation on a government to government level?
Not quite, because when you're in government, you've got a more specific agenda. You've got a clearer definition of success, and it's often to try to influence the not just thinking but behavior of the other side, to get them to sign on to some policy, to support something. Here it's different. This is one step removed. You want to one, get smarter. Two, you want to influence, ideally, the thinking of others, maybe build something of a consensus around the body of ideas. But we don't have power here. We're one step removed from power. At most, we have influence. So I see this as different. In government, when I would meet with my foreign counterparts, I had a pretty clear concept or understanding of what I was trying to accomplish, and it was pretty practical. Here, it's more one step removed. I'm thinking slightly longer term, and again, our influence is more indirect. In some cases, you may influence not immediate policy, but you could influence people, say, who in a couple of years will be in positions of power. One of the things I like to think we do at the councils, we're not just in the ideas business at the Council on Foreign Relations, producing ideas in foreign affairs or books or articles. We're also in the talent development business. I look at this administration. There's probably a dozen people in this administration who were one time or another on the staff of the Council on Foreign Relations. And these people have tooled up, and now they're in positions of considerable responsibility. There's dozens of people in the administration and the Congress, dozens, even more, who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, who have been going to our meetings for years or decades. And I mentioned to you before the internship programs. We have a lot of younger members and research associates. The whole idea is to, again, develop talent. And because foreign policy is going to be made by people. And so if we can, yes, generate ideas and good analysis and potential recommendations for policy, but also help people tool up. So if and when they're given the chance for responsibility, they're better able to carry it out. then I think we've made a difference in another way.
Dr. Haass, thank you so much for this interview. It was a very insightful discussion, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for asking all these important questions.
Thank you.